Content warning. Hey friends, before we dive in, I want to let you know that this episode contains open and honest conversations about mental illness, substance use, and suicide. Some of these stories may be difficult to hear. If you're in a sensitive place right now, please take care of yourself and feel free to skip this one. Thanks for being here. The following is a conversation with Tyler Kania, an inspiring author, former rugby player, and a mental health advocate. Tyler's story is one of resilience, transformation, and courage. From navigating life-altering injuries and bipolar disorder to returning to the rugby field and writing the Maniac with no knees, he has faced every challenge with incredible strength. I'm your host, Sid Ben Salah. Let's dive in. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Rugby is such a unique sport demanding strategy, strength, and teamwork. Let's start with your root in the game. What drew you to rugby and how did it feel to find your calling on the field?
Rugby in America is still developing a little bit. I'm from Eastern Connecticut, which is a lot of farmland and it's really rural. On the other side of the state, there's a lot of youth rugby. In fact, it's one of the best hotbeds for youth rugby in the country. But where I live, there's no youth rugby within 45 minutes. My dad played, but growing up, I played a lot of football. That was my main sport. I was the captain of my high school team. I also did swimming, I did baseball, and I did track. As much as I loved football, it didn't really align with my skill set as an athlete. But what I did get from it, one of the positions that I played was long snapper. A little known secret for rugby players is that the long snapping position in football kind of makes you more adept at the long pass. And it really kind of made me a natural when I ended up taking on rugby. So as, the first time I ever touched the ball, I spun it behind my back across the field and set up a score. And it was pretty much instantaneous. Like I was like, wow, I found my game. Like this is what I can do really well. And it really only blossomed from there. So I was really fortunate that I did find rugby because, I knew that I was a great athlete. I just hadn't found my sport yet. And rugby gave me everything that I knew that I could possibly be.
Yeah. You played as a fly half, which is a crucial leadership role. How did that shape your mindset and approach the game?
Yeah, fly half is like the quarterback, right? You are in charge of the offense. You are leading the communication when it comes to plays. You are touching the ball every time, passing the ball and kicking the ball. And you're the leader on the field. I like to be in control of everything. I'm always the loudest guy on the field. And, fly half gave me that autonomy to really help my players out with good, crisp passing. And, I wouldn't want to play any other position. It makes me really upset when other people have to play fly half because I want to be in control. And, I think that when I am in control, it only leads to good things. I think my record as a starting fly half is something like 35-3. So, we don't lose much when I play that position. And I take a lot of pride in that.
And Tyler, let's talk about something different. What did you make about the last Super Bowl?
You can probably tell from my voice, I'm coming back from the flu.
Yeah.
And, when the Super Bowl came, I was pretty sick. I was rooting for the Eagles and, I really didn't want to see Patrick Mahomes win another Super Bowl. I was just sick of the Chiefs winning all the time. I wanted to have Saquon Barkley win a Super Bowl. And, I ended up going to sleep in the first quarter, but it seemed like the game was already in hand at that point. The last thing I remember were the 2 back-to-back interceptions. And so it helped me sleep a little better that night.
Yeah, what a game. I think the majority, especially here in Europe, everyone was thinking that the Chiefs will win it again. But since the get-go, it was quite clear that the Eagles, they were just flying. Defense, offense, everything. Yeah. And Tyler, looking back, what were your dreams before injuries and mental health struggles came into play?
Yeah. I graduated college in 2014. At that time, there was no Major League Rugby in America. That came about in 2018, when I was still away from the sport. But, when I was playing, I had ambitions to play at the highest level. My college team, we won 3 championships. We went to 4, and I had been selected for a bunch of all-star teams, and even, when we won the Connecticut Cup championship, I was MVP of the tournament, and the head coach of a premier rugby team was in attendance, and he recruited me and one of my best friends to join his team of mostly international players. It was the cream of the crop, prior to the MLR. Like, I had a teammate who was on Team USA. I had a teammate who represented Fiji for his
Hmm.
country. I had teammates from Australia and Scotland. And it was an adjustment in terms of like the speed of the play. But what I realized is, especially when you play fly half, you're only as good as the people around you, right? So when you have a lot of skilled players around the fly half, it makes your job a lot easier. It makes you look a lot
Hmm.
better. And, I found that I could play at that level. Like I said, it wasn't a adjustment. Like, my tackling partner was the guy I mentioned from the national team of Fiji. And the first time I tried to tackle him, he shifted on me and I went and reached out at him and, I grabbed onto his junk by mistake. And it was really embarrassing, but it kind of was one of those learning experiences where it's like, okay, like this is a little different than the doofuses at the college
Hmm.
level. You got to really buckle down and figure this out. And I do think that, like, if I hadn't had the bad luck with my 2 ruptured patellar tendons, and if I didn't have my bipolar illness, which kept me off of the field for over 4 years, I really think I could have done something special with the sport. And I'm still chasing that, right? I'm recovering from my second ruptured patellar tendon now. And, I'm working hard to get back on the field. And I do think that I have more left in the tank, especially, if I played a different position, it would be a lot harder. But the fly half can, like a quarterback, they can hopefully play for a lot longer than other positions. So I'm hoping that, some of my best playing days are still ahead of
Yeah,
me.
yeah. Many people they give up after injuries or repetitive injuries. What kept you fighting to come back, Tyler?
My mental illness has really taken a big toll on me, on my well-being, on, my life. And, over time I've realized that there's kind of, if you suffer from mental illness, there's kind of three things that you need to live a healthy life. And the first two have to do with
Mm.
rugby for me anyways. Number one is community, right? If you want to get better from a mental illness, you need a group of people, whether that's your family, your friends, your sports team, or your job or whatever, that kind of holds you accountable, that, brings you that social connection and that brings you joy. And besides that, you need a goal, right? You need to wake up every morning and you need to have something that's driving you
Mm.
forward, something that moves you to act and do something and try to improve your life situation. And that's rugby for me too. And then the third thing, is medication, right? And a lot of people resist that. It can be really, really frustrating to, especially with psychiatric illnesses, because it's trial and
Mm.
error. I cycled through over a dozen different medications before I found the right one. And some of those medications had really horrific side effects that traumatized me. But, I'm thankful that I kept at it. And I'm thankful that I finally got the help that I need to now live a relatively stable life.
Wow. Fast forward nearly 5 years, you return to rugby. That's not something we see often. What was going through your mind as you stepped back onto the field after such a long
Eh,
break?
This is a good story. On the last day of April in 2021, I tried to commit suicide.
Hmm.
I tried to hang myself. I put a noose around my neck and, I tightened it a bit and I looked outside. The clouds parted and the late afternoon sun came out. And all of a sudden, I remembered in that moment that one of my best friends was getting married the next
Mhm.
day. I didn't want to mess up it. I didn't want to like ruin his special day. So I figured I might as well stick around a little longer. And then the next week, I got invited to go to a rugby player's birthday party. I hadn't seen these rugby guys in over 4 years. When I quit rugby, I threw out everything that reminded me of it. I stopped communicating with all my rugby friends, and I put it behind me. So to be invited to this party 4 years later when I hadn't worked in over a year and I was just coming off of a suicide attempt, it made me really, I felt ashamed, right? Like I had been these guys' team captain in college. I had been the guy with endless confidence. And, now I had none of that. I didn't like who I was as a person and I didn't want to let them know who I had become. Um, but I swallowed my pride and I went to that party. And, there's new teammates present. They're watching Six Nations rugby on TV and they've got a ball.
Mhm.
And he passed me that ball, and as soon as I touched it, it was like, I felt like I can still do this. I still felt that confidence, that pride, that passion. All of it came back to me.
Mhm.
And, they tell me that our old college coach was now coaching the men's club team in Hartford, and they had an exhibition game against New Haven the following weekend. And they invited me to go watch. So I show up. I don't want to talk to anybody, right? I was like, I was disassociating myself from the world. I wanted to see my 4 former college teammates play. And then I just wanted to turn back around and get back to my miserable existence. Um, but my old coach's wife was in the stands that day. And, she had been a great source of confidence for me in college. And, here she was kind of like encouraging me to get back into it.
Mhm.
And so, like I said, this was an exhibition game. It wasn't anything real competitive or crazy or anything like that. So when an injury happened with about 10 minutes left, somehow she was like, get in the game. And I went to the coach and he was like, yeah, go in. So I took my jeans off, put on somebody else's rugby shorts and rugby boots, and I ran onto the field. And mind you, the last time I had played was 4.5 years ago.
Mhm.
And the last time I touched the ball, my knee ended up in my
Wow.
quad. I hadn't been lifting weights. I hadn't been training for this, but I knew I could still
Mm.
do it. And the first time I touched the ball, I got it on the outside. I made a move on someone, stepped inside, passed it to the guy on my outside, and he scored the game winning
Wow.
try. And, all of a sudden, it was crazy because none of the teammates besides my old college friends knew
Mm.
who I was or what I could do on the field. And so they were like, who is this guy? Like, what the heck?
So this person out of
Um,
nowhere, he just last minute gets in and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So rugby came back into my life when I needed it most, right? I needed community. I needed a
Mm.
goal. I needed something to look forward to. And so all of a sudden rugby was back in my life. And I worked hard to get back and get back to my potential. I ended up getting hurt a couple months later. And serendipitously, this is how I kind of, there's a million crazy things about my
Mm.
story that make me think that there's a power greater than man
Mm.
because I got hurt and you'd think, okay, well, that's it. Like, but the very next day, the college women's rugby team, 8 minutes from my house, had their head coaching job open up. And I applied for it and I got the
Mhm.
job. And, it changed my life.
Let's go back to what you said. So last minute, the coach asks you to jump in, you change, you go. You didn't play for almost 4 years. How did it feel to play again, both physically and mentally? If you can just walk us through, I don't know how many minutes you played that day.
Yeah, it was less than 10
Hmm.
minutes. And, when I was going on the field, I had those
Hmm.
butterflies. Normally back in the day, I wouldn't get butterflies. It was fearless. But it was something about conquering my fears, right? Overcoming that injury, overcoming those years of mental illness. And it was almost like the moment I stepped on the field, I knew I was at home again. And that was a really comforting
Hmm.
feeling, right? It was the only thing in my life that had ever made me think that I was really worth something.
Yeah.
And to not have that for all those years and then to have it come rushing back in the moment when I didn't even expect
Mm.
it to happen, that's just one of those things where it's like, okay, someone else is helping me make these
Mhm.
decisions, and I'm really fortunate
Did
for
you
that.
hesitate? Was there any moment prior? So
No
just
hesitation.
go.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had my 4 college teammates and I knew that they knew what I
Hmm.
could do. And I wanted to prove myself to them again, you know, because I miss playing with them, and I'm sure that they miss playing with
And how
me
did you
too.
feel the next day physically?
You know, I didn't get
Ah,
tackled
okay.
that game. That was the only time I touched the ball. The only time I touched the ball and worked
Yeah.
out. Um, and, you know, I think I made maybe 1 tackle, so I wasn't really sore. It was I got all the good benefits of rugby without any of the bad things, you know, which was a good way to ease my way back into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. You've been incredibly open, Tyler, about your struggles with bipolar disorder. Let's talk about that journey. When did you first realize something was different with your mental health?
After my first ruptured patellar tendon, you know, bipolar is something that typically doesn't manifest until your mid
Hmm.
20s. For me, you know, there were some things in college, like I got arrested in college, and, you know, at the time it was like, okay, well, am I just a crazy college kid that made a big mistake? Or is there something more to this? You know? And it wasn't until that ruptured patellar tendon that I first had a manic episode for the first time. And when you're manic, you're righteous, your brain works really fast, you think you're about to change the world in some cases, you have no risk tolerance, you just see a goal. And that can be good. It can be a superpower, right? You don't care what people think. You just want to accomplish your goal and you're willing to do anything to achieve that. You know, that first time I went manic after my ruptured patellar tendon, that was when I made the impulse decision to quit rugby, throw all my rugby stuff away. I made the impulse decision to quit my 6-figure job in
Hmm.
cybersecurity. I made the impulse decision to move out to Idaho and travel across the West for several months. And basically, that trip was a way of running away from my distractions in my brain. You know, I had no explanation for how my behavior had changed over, you know, that period of time. And so I was scared of it. And so I ran away from my life and I had to just keep my mind busy to try and, you know, alleviate things, but it would only get progressively worse over the years. You know, there were years where I was stable and I was okay and I was working and I was, you know, running and, you know, pretty productive. But when you're bipolar, you know, your house of cards could topple at any moment,
Yeah.
right? You could go manic at any moment and completely ruin your reputation. You can completely ruin your career. And I've done that over and over and over again. And, you know, the other side of bipolar, you know, there's the mania and then there's the depression. And, you know, I'll take the mania 10 times 10 times a day if I don't ever have to have
Mhm.
that depression because, you know, suicidal depression is so insidious. You know, it's like, you know, I'd be walking my dog down the street and I'd see myself hanging from a tree every day
Mhm.
for months. You know, I would keep a rope in my room just in case I was ready to step off of the chair that night. And those feelings didn't leave me for a long time. And so I had to end up being institutionalized. And, you know, thankfully I got the help that I
Mhm.
needed.
Mhm. What were some of the biggest misconceptions or stigmas you encountered?
Yeah, I think for one, like I said, like bipolar people with mental illness have superpowers, right? You know, we have a lot of bad things that come with our illness. You know, we're blessed, and it's a reason why so many prolific achievers in
Mm.
history were bipolar. You have Vincent van Gogh, you have Ernest
Mhm.
Hemingway, Sylvia Plath, you have Winston
Yeah.
Churchill,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, the reason why these people were so prolific was because, you know, our illness makes us more curious. Our illness makes us more creative. Our illness gives us more empathy, right? When we're manic, our illness gives us more
Mm.
energy and we don't care what people think. And these are all superpowers. And so what the general public doesn't realize is that there are advantages to having mental health issues,
Mhm.
right? You know, I think there's a long way to go for the general public to learn more about mental illness because the way I've been treating, like particularly in the workplace, I mean, in 2025, corporate America, you know, this is what it looks like. If you're black, you're great. If you're gay, you're
Mhm.
great. If you're transgender, you're great. But if you're bipolar, you're the first person that gets shot coming through the door
Wow.
because they care about mental illness, but they only care about mental illness if you have some little slight anxiety problem. If you actually have a real mental illness and you actually need health care to
Hmm.
live every day, you know, they don't want you because you're crazy and they don't want to manage that.
Yeah.
But, they don't realize that, what makes you crazy is also what makes you a great employee when you're, in the right
Mm,
state of mind.
mm.
And so, like I said, you could have such a great experience at a company and you can be so, prolific in your achievements, and then after 2 years or something, it can all just
Yeah.
topple. And so that's made me have to work harder and harder, on the days that I do have a right
Mm,
state of mind, right? Because I know that I have to overcome
mm.
this. And so I have to do what I can to, achieve what I can when I'm able to.
And how did therapy and medication change the way you approach life and sports?
Yeah. Well, before I had the right medication, I wasn't stable at all. I would have multiple manic episodes a year. And if I wasn't manic, I was deathly depressed. So when lithium came into my life when I was hospitalized, lithium's a mood
Hmm.
stabilizer. It's as old as time. Um, there's some side effects, but they're not as bad as some of the other medications that I was on before that. For instance, the worst thing about my lithium medication is it kind of dulls my creativity a little. I used to love painting. I used to just have a set of acrylic paints and a canvas and I could just do figure it out, paint something, and now that's more difficult for me. But I would trade it every single day because now I live a stable
Hmm.
life and I'm really
Mm.
fortunate for that. Besides that, I take antipsychotics every night and those help me with my mood. They help me from getting too depressed. They make me a lot hungrier than I would be normally. So there's kind of the weight thing that you have to watch
Hmm.
out for. But it's a worthwhile trade off, because living the way I was living was torture for me. As far as therapy goes, look, therapy isn't the end all be all for anybody. But what therapy is is a mirror for your thoughts. That's all it is. We don't go to a big event without looking in the mirror, right? We need to see how we
Right.
look. And when you're going through therapy, you just you just talk about what's going on in your life. And sometimes just by saying those words, it doesn't matter what the therapist says to you. Just by saying them, it's rewiring how you're going to act moving forward. And so it's necessary. Like it's you don't have to be mentally ill to see the benefits of
Mm.
therapy. Everybody should be in. Everybody should have that, that mirror to check how they're doing.
Yeah.
And we can all
Yeah.
improve. So, there's always something to gain from that
Mm,
experience.
mm. There were moments where you nearly gave up. Let's talk about what pulled you back. You spoke earlier, Tyler, about two key moments, correct me if I'm wrong, that made you decide to give life another chance. That was the wedding of one of your teammates, and later on was a birthday party.
And there was another incident, but
Yeah.
sure.
And you spoke briefly about the role of community. How did your community, family, friends, or teammates support your recovery?
Oh God. I'm so fortunate to have the family and friends that I have, to have the parents that didn't give
Mm.
up, the parents that were willing to try anything, drive me anywhere, bring me to the hospital, care for me. But what's really touching to me was the role my best friend played in the whole ordeal. After the second time I attempted suicide when I was living in Memphis and I overdosed on medication, I moved home and I spent, the next couple months very, very depressed. And many days I wouldn't get out of bed. But on some days, my friend who was a stonemason, he was an entrepreneur. He would ask me to work for him, and I wasn't any good at it. I worked hard. I couldn't follow his directions because of how depressed I was. I you know, was taking his money when he was losing money on
Mhm.
projects, and I wasn't like a good employee. I tried hard, but my mind wasn't there. But he kept at it and he kept giving me that thing to do. And he didn't care that I was only a shell of myself. He didn't care that I wasn't the person that he had known
Mhm.
his whole life. He just knew that I needed help. And, you know, he was going through his own things, but he put those things aside to make sure that I had a little money in my pocket, to make sure that I had something to wake up to every morning to try and, keep me busy. And, he is not someone who talks about his emotions. You know, he he he'd be calling me a jackass all day long, right? But, his intention,
Mm.
his actions spoke a lot louder than
Than his
his
words, yeah.
words. And I'm really fortunate for that friendship because otherwise I would have just been in bed the
Mhm.
whole time and I probably would have tried it again. So I'm
Yeah.
fortunate for that.
Well, shout out to your friend.
Yeah, definitely.
Tyler, what advice would you give someone who feels like there is no way forward?
Keep asking for help. I went so long without
Mm.
asking for help. I just tried to run away from it. And I think that's part of the personification of, a male in America anyways. We are prideful and we don't want to ask
Mhm.
for help, but you know, we're not able to do this alone. You need things like community, you need things like goals, you need things like therapy and medication. And if you're able to just keep moving forward and keep trying, eventually things are going to work out.
Mhm. Yeah. Let's shift gear a little bit. Writing is one of the most powerful tools for processing trauma. Your book is, I believe, is a proof of that. What made you start writing the Maniac with no knees during a manic episode?
Huh. Yeah, I mean, you just said it. It was that manic episode, right? Like I after I was institutionalized, I got my life back together. I got a job at the largest cybersecurity company in the world, and I was working hard to get back on the rugby field. By the spring of 2024, I was in the best shape of my life, and like you said, I ruptured my patellar tendon. It was the first play of the second game of the season. Um, and before that, like I thought it would finally be my year for showing the world what I could do on the rugby field and showing the world what I could do in cybersecurity sales. And when that all came crashing down, I think, that manic episode made me feel like I needed to share myself with the world, right? Like, because if you've had two ruptured patellar tendons, that's
Yeah.
extraordinary,
That,
right? It happens once for every 147,000
mm,
human years. You know, to have it happen twice, that's crazy. On top of that, to have bipolar I disorder and to have the life that I had lived, I knew that I had lived a crazy life and none of my friends knew it,
mm,
right? I had always been ashamed of myself. I had never shared myself on social media, but something was pulling me in that direction. Something was saying, you need to come forward and you need to share yourself. And, one of those inspirations was the people that I was institutionalized with, the people with schizophrenia, the people with aphasia, the people who get electroshock therapy all the time. They were suffering far worse than me. They didn't have the blessings that I had, like growing up in a wealthy, white, nuclear educated family or being a good looking athlete that automatically gives you
mm,
confidence. They didn't have those things. And so they're not capable of sharing their story. And so I felt like it was my responsibility to stand up on their behalf to try and help erase the stigma, try and help make things a better place and a less lonely place for the people that suffer and for the general public, to give them a better understanding of mental
mhm,
illness, right? So that was a
mhm,
big driver. But again, like, when you're manic, you're not in control of your thoughts. And so I'm adamant that there was something that was pushing me towards my means to the end. It was pushing me towards writing that book. And so when that manic episode subsided, when I got back from the hospital, I knew what my goal was. I knew what my plan was. And somehow, I knew what to write every single day. It was like divine intervention. It was like I'd wake up and I just knew what the next page was gonna be.
Yeah.
I'd never been a writer before. I had read quite a bit, but, I had never had plans to write a book. My Mania had different plans though, and so I'm really fortunate. I've had so many manic episodes that ruined my
Mm.
life, so I
But
guess I was due to have one of those manic episodes make my
yeah,
life.
yeah. And on that, I would like to ask you some questions about the whole process writing the book in that manic episode. How did you start?
Um, it originally it wasn't gonna it was basically, I wanted to show the world what I had done on the rugby field
Hmm.
already and then share them my time away from the sport. And so at first the book was basically going to be about my time away from rugby. Until I realized that my comeback to rugby is what really made the story. So there was some adjustments that were made, as I wrote. But I had so many good stories that I just knew that the narrative was gonna be there. What became a challenge was adding in introspection and adding in what other characters might have been thinking, during certain moments of the
Hmm.
story. And it's tough to remove yourself from a first person to be like, okay, this is how I was feeling during that moment. But it was like my illness would become mute from the storyline, but it wasn't mute from my life, obviously. So I had to work hard to try and weave those things together. And one of the big reasons for, being able to achieve it finally was my structural editor, who was a friend of a friend, a former rugby
Hmm.
player who came out of the woods like an angel because I didn't know anybody in the writing industry. I didn't know how to publish a book. I didn't know how to edit a book, and I didn't know anybody. So eventually, one of my best friends was like, "Oh, you should talk to this guy." And thankfully, he was willing to help, and thankfully, he was willing to help for only $20 an hour. But his involvement was so instrumental.
Yeah. And through the writing process, did it help you to understand your own journey?
Definitely. Oh yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, like, especially when you're trying to think about what the other people involved were thinking, right? Because it's tough to remove yourself from that first person. And it's tough to consider how your actions might have made other people feel. Stuff like when I wrote about my time coaching the Eastern Connecticut State University women's rugby team, where we won a championship. And then I lost my job before I was able to coach another game after that
Hmm.
championship. Understanding how my actions affected the players on that team. It was a hard pill to swallow. It was a hard pill to swallow when I was writing about my substance abuse problems. But, aside from all the bad things that I kind of had to come to reconcile with myself, there was that overarching theme that was like, you actually have a lot of resilience, Tyler. Like, you came back from this and that and this, and you just kept going. And so, the writing experience helped make me realize, like, wow, I'm valid as far as, a comeback story goes. And, I was really proud of that. But, it was just like therapy, right? Like writing is a mirror for your thoughts too. And, every day, you learn something just by putting a pen to paper.
Yeah. Yeah. What's one message from your book that you hope sticks with readers?
Well, I want them to understand what the conditions are like inside of a mental health hospital. How you're not allowed to go outside, how there's no group activities really, how nobody wants to really talk because they're too damaged, how there's no real like good books or, things to enjoy while you're there. We had one TV, one
Hmm.
tiny TV for 30 people. And there was one guy who only spoke Spanish. And since he only spoke Spanish, we just gave him the remote and he would just keep the channel stuck on the Spanish channel. And so there'd be 30 people watching. Only one of them can understand what's going on. And then like the food was horrible. You don't get a fork, you don't get a knife, you don't get shoelaces, and there's people strapped to their beds. There's people screaming and trying to fight nurses. And it can be a really dark place. But it's important to remember that when you're an inpatient, they don't try and heal you. They try and stabilize your condition so that you're not a threat to yourself or to anybody else. But when you graduate from inpatient therapy into outpatient, that's when you start to heal. That's when I got to explore the beautiful campus. It was one of the oldest mental health hospitals in
Hmm.
the country. It's like an old college campus. We had $20 food vouchers, and all of a sudden, I was able to eat sugar and drink coffee again, and I was able to eat at the same dining hall as all the doctors instead of the
Okay.
crap that they would bring us in
Hmm.
inpatient, and I was able to go to group therapy where people were healed enough to share their story, and people were able to relate to me, and people were able to hear my story and empathize with me, and you make friends. You sit at a lunch table, you make friends. And, outpatient therapy was a really, really good experience for me. I'm grateful for the inpatient because that's when they figured out what was wrong with me, and that's when they gave me lithium and stuff
Hmm.
like that. But that outpatient scenario, that was really,
Something,
really
yeah.
something
Yeah.
special to
Yeah.
me.
After your playing days, you turned to coaching. What made you want to step into that role?
Yeah. Well, I was still playing. I'd gotten hurt, and so I took that coaching job. Um, and part of it was that community that I needed, right?
Hmm.
Part of it was having 30 people that look up to you, that you have a common goal with, that you're working and training every day together. You know, Part of it was I knew that I would be good at it and I wanted to prove myself, right? Like I'm a competitor and I've always got a chip on my shoulder no matter what. And, I wanted to show what I could do as a coach. And it was a really special experience. And I'm really disappointed with how it ended. To this day, the last game I've ever coached was a championship. And someday I'm going to coach
Hmm.
again. I still want to play for a few more years. Hopefully, my body can hold up. But as soon as I can't play anymore, I'm thankful that I know what the next step in the journey is going to be. And I'm thankful that I can have a community even after I stop playing.
Yeah. Yeah. You've become a strong advocate for mental health in sports. What still needs to change, in your opinion?
As far as
Hmm.
sports goes, I don't know. I don't know exactly what needs to change on the overarching group setting. I think, individuals need to be more honest with their teammates and with themselves. And, the more people that come forward and say, I go through this too, because rugby is not a sport. Rugby is a conduit for social change.
Hmm.
And what's great about it is there's 15 people on the field. There's, 30 some odd, 40 people on the team. And they're all there for the same reason. They want to have fun alongside friends, and a lot of them are running away from their issues. A lot of them, are playing rugby because they need something in their life to change. And rugby gives them that podium. It gives them that opportunity to think of themselves differently and to make friends and make connections. So I don't think anything about sports needs to change as far as mental health goes. I think individuals just need to be
Yeah,
more
yeah.
open
And why do you think mental health is still so stigmatized, especially for male athletes?
because it's weakness, and nobody wants to show how weak they are. Nobody wants to say that their life isn't perfect or that they think about taking their life or
Mhm.
that, they are so depressed that they can't get out of bed sometimes. People see this tinted window of social media and they think that their life has to look like the next
Yeah.
person's life. And, I'm someone who is at this point pretty vocal on social media. I wrote this book, I do all these interviews, and a lot of people look up to
Mhm.
me and they say, wow, he made it to the other side of bipolar.
What feedback you got on?
Well,
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I'm still struggling with bipolar
Mm.
every day, right? Just because I'm doing these interviews and stuff like that and wrote this book, like that doesn't mean that I overcame a lifelong illness. right? I still have substance abuse problems every day. I still have, I tell people I'm not
Mm,
suicidal, but I think about suicide every day, right? And there's a fundamental difference in
mm,
those two things. So no matter what, like, you know, people are going to struggle no matter how good their life is. And, the more that others understand that tinted window on social media of sharing these podcasts and these television interviews, that's not the whole
yeah,
thing. We're having a great conversation now, but when we hang up, I'm still going to be
yeah,
struggling, right? And so it's important for people to understand
yeah.
that.
And in sports, how can teams, coaches, and institutions better support players struggling with mental health?
Well, it just starts with one person being open, because once one person is open,
Mm,
other people are open. And I would try that as a coach. I didn't want to reveal to these college students all about my
but yeah,
trials and tribulations, but I wanted to have them understand that life after college, life after sports
mm,
is tough, and you're gonna go through stuff, and you're gonna have days where you don't recognize that face in the mirror. But no matter what, no matter who you become, whether you're a drug addict or homeless or, mentally ill, your teammates are never going to forget the person that you truly
mm,
are. Because when you get on a field with someone and you bleed and you cry and you sweat and you work hard for a goal, that shows the people around you more about you than anything else. And so, like I said, sports are a conduit for social change. And it just takes that first person to step up and say, yeah, I
yeah.
struggle. And hopefully other people follow
Mm,
their lead.
mm. Tyler, you've come a long way, but this is not the end of your story. What's next for you?
I talked about how my first book kind of happened by
Hmm.
accident. And actually, my second book kind of happened by accident too, because, what I do is on Instagram, almost every day, I share a one-page short
Hmm.
essay. Sometimes it's about addiction or mental health or rugby or whatever. And, I realized after writing about 50 of those that I could just put together a book of
Nice.
short essays. So, in dedication to Carrie Fisher, I'm naming it Postcards from the
Mm,
Edge, and I've got about 82 short essays so far. I'm aiming for 100. I'm going to take my
mhm.
time on it. I don't want to publish it in the first year after my first book. I want to give my book a year to kind of, get the
Mm,
attention. But then I've got other stuff in the works. Like it's tough to make money as a writer, but I realize that there's an opportunity with changing how obituaries are
okay.
done. So instead of having this short blurb about who someone was, who they loved, where they died, what they did for a living, it's basically you interview 4 or 5 family members, you interview a couple
Hmm.
friends, and you try and tell like a 5 to 10 page story about their life. And it's like, we lose our best stories with
Mm.
the dead, right? I don't know how it is where you live, but where I live, I don't know anything about my great grandpa or like anybody that's a couple generations
It's the
above
same.
me,
It's the same
you
everywhere.
know?
Yeah.
Right, right. And so, you know, grandchildren want to know about their
Mm,
grandfather. And so I think that this is a good way to kind of pass down family memories, down, through generations. You only print like a dozen or so copies for all the
mhm,
close people, and then they have it on their coffee table, for their kids to look at someday. And I'm working on my first two. I did my first two of them for free because I need samples to give to funeral
mhm.
homes and families of the deceased. But the first one is one of my dad's best friends who passed away last year. He was a 75-year-old dentist who lived an incredible life. And then the second one was a friend of mine who died of suicide.
Okay.
He was a hockey player who suffered from a lot of
Oof.
CTE,
Concussions. Yeah.
concussions in his brain. And yeah, actually, that one was pretty crazy because I wrote a short essay
Mhm,
about him um, on the anniversary of his death, and his sister was like, "This is amazing!" Like, and I was like, "I'd love
mm,
to write more about him," and she was like, "Let's do it." So I'm excited about that one. So I got a couple projects going on. I don't know what the future holds in
Mm,
terms of rugby, but I know I'm going to keep
mm,
working hard to get back on the field because that's my community. That's what makes me
mm.
feel good.
What a fantastic idea. How do you keep yourself grounded and moving forward despite the challenges?
I think when you have been through as much as like everybody goes through struggles, everybody um, goes through hardship and has their own issues, and everybody gets better from those issues. What I've been through is a little extreme in a lot of cases. And I think it's carved me into a person that, is really tough, is really resilient, is really empathetic, and really understands that not everything's going to go
Mhm.
your way. I'm never going
Right.
to have 30 good days in a row. It's
Yeah.
not going to happen. I have a week a month where I'm basically laying in bed and I feel like I can't do anything. And that's what I deal with. But from what I've been through, I've learned to appreciate life for the good times and the bad. I've learned to appreciate those bad times because I'm like a block of marble and I keep getting chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. And you think that they're taking away from me, but in reality, they're carving me into something beautiful.
Hmm. What does success mean to you now compared to when you started?
I used to look at monetary success as, something that was pretty important. When I stopped playing rugby, I got really into my cybersecurity career when
Hmm.
I was healthy. At one point I made a quarter million dollars when I was 26, and that was my identity. That was how I took pride in who I was. I thought I was cool. I thought I was good. I thought I was someone that should be sought after by women, because of my checkbook or whatever. I'm broke now, and I feel like I'm as much of a success as I've ever been, right? This book has been
Yeah.
successful to me. And, 6 or 7 years ago, I don't know what I would think of who I am today, but I'm a lot prouder of the man I've become, despite not having a big income than who I was when I did have that big income. And I think, that personal development is really beautiful. And I hope that more people that worked in the industry that I worked in can find that because it's sad the way that people treat their career or their net worth as something of such high value when in reality, like all it does is give you more
Hmm.
resources, you know, and resources can be good or bad. When you're lean and you don't have many resources, that's when you
Yeah.
learn. That's
Right.
when you get good.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Tyler, before we wrap up, let's have some fun with the quick lightning round. Just say whatever comes to mind first.
Sure.
And what's your favorite rugby memory?
When I was a junior, we made it to like the regional semifinal match. We were like 2 matches away from going to the
Hmm.
final four in Denver, Colorado. And we were a public school of guys who like not a lot of us played rugby in high school or anything like that. Our coach was making like $4,000 for the
Hmm.
year. And, we end up playing the number 3 team in the country, New England College,
Okay.
and they have all these scholarship players from all around the world, Asia, South America,
Europe.
Europe, you
Mm.
name it. And the first play of the game, I intercepted a pass and took it all the way to score. And then the second play of the game, I attacked the defense. I popped a little kick up over them, and my teammate caught it and scored. And we almost won that game. We
Mm.
lost, but it was really special. And then the following spring, I mentioned that I was MVP of the Connecticut Cup
Hmm.
championship
You did, yeah.
tournament. I scored 4 times in the championship
Nice.
game and, assisted a bunch of other times. And there's a video of me at the end with the trophy and I'm just drinking a beer out of it and I'm shirtless. And, it was kind of my peak. It hasn't gotten any better since then.
Fantastic. One book that has inspired you.
The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath.
Mhm. A song that always lifts your spirit.
Jubal by Klingandi.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Who is your role model?
My dad, I guess. My mom and my
Mhm.
dad.
Great. Best advice you've ever received?
Best advice I've ever received. When I was working for a cybersecurity startup, I was doing really, really well. And I thought pretty highly of myself. And I was really demanding. And I think a lot of it was my illness at the time. I was manic much of the time, but I was rude to a lot of my
Okay.
coworkers. And I'm not proud of that at all. But I got to the point where one of the owners of the business was like, look, we know you're great. We know
Mm.
you're awesome, but you need to understand that you can't do this all on yourself. And you're not perfect and you don't know everything. And you need to take consideration into other people. And that was one of those moments where I kind of had to swallow a lot of pride because, I wasn't conscious that I was doing anything wrong. But when he addressed me and told me like, this is how you're making other people feel, that was a seminal moment to kind of helping me find my path.
Hmm. What's the most underrated aspect of rugby?
The fact that there's 15 people and everybody touches the ball.
Yes. A habit that keeps you grounded.
Running, long distance
Long
running.
distance running. What is your favorite city you've visited?
New York City,
Mhm.
that's home. That's home away from home.
What's a fun fact about you people don't know?
A fun fact about me that people don't know. I used to be a decent opera singer.
Aha. Okay.
I can't do it right now because of my voice, but
Maybe in a couple of months.
yeah, at one point, I was really slow
Mhm.
to mature physically. Like I didn't have a growth spurt until I was, in college
Mhm.
basically. So I was like this little
Yeah.
short guy with like a really high voice. I could sing this incredible opera.
What's the best way to unwind after a tough day?
um, Laying on the couch, watching a movie or something like that with my dog next to
Hmm.
me.
Nice. Tyler, if you could have a dinner with anyone, let's say a historical figure, who will it be and why?
Jack Kerouac,
Why?
the
Hmm.
writer. I think he is basically the 1950s version of me. He was an adventurer, he was an athlete, he was a writer, he was someone who just like jumped into the void and would go on these crazy expeditions. And he wrote
Hmm.
beautifully. He was a big, I told you that The Bell Jar by
Hmm.
Sylvia Plath
Hmm.
inspired me. You know, those two books were the two ones that like I wanted to emulate with my book.
Nice. And lastly, if you could give an advice or a piece of wisdom to our listeners on any topic.
What's been a capitalist society is typically a world of specialists, right? We all have one career and we have to be good at that one niche career and we spend years and years doing it and we don't know how to do a whole lot of other
Hmm.
things. Um, because of my illness, I've had to adapt and try different careers and do a bunch of different things and challenge my mind in different ways. And I've developed a set of cross disciplinary skills that work across, different
Hmm.
mediums, right? Like my writing ability, which has come from all the reading I've done, you know, that's helps me write better emails for, sales or helps me write books or helps me, just get my point across to my family or friends. So I would encourage other people to, you know, really embrace diving into new hobbies, right? Like I'm not a great painter, but I love painting,
Hmm.
you know. I don't know a ton about cryptocurrency, but I tried to start my own company, and I learned a
Hmm.
ton from that. I didn't know anything about coaching before I started coaching, but I tried that, and the list
Yeah.
goes on. So yeah, just keep moving forward, keep trying new things. Don't bottle yourself into just one vocation and one road to the rest of your life.
Mhm. Tyler, Kania, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you for having me. This has been
And
great.
before we wrap up, can you tell our listeners where they can contact you, learn more about your work, or connect with you online?
Yeah. Obviously you can go to Amazon and you can buy the Maniac with No
Hmm.
Knees. You can follow me on Instagram at Tyler_Kania, Kania. That's kind of my headquarters for updating people on my story, on, sharing my short essays, and, I use it quite a bit. And then, the last would just be tylerkania.com. But really all that is a description of my book and a link to, the Amazon page.
Fantastic. As we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with a quote from Albert Camus, a French philosopher, writer, and journalist. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that there was in me an invisible summer. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit that download button, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support fuels these powerful conversations and help us bring more inspiring stories to you. And now you can watch the full episode on our YouTube and Spotify channel. Join us there, hit subscribe, and help us grow this incredible community. I'm Sid Ben Salah, and this is Pre-Zero Sports Talk Podcast. Until next time, stay inspired, stay resilient, and we'll see you next. Bye-bye.